Welcome to the Decipher podcast. I'm Dennis Fisher. I'm here with my colleague Lindsay O'Donnell Welch. We're here to talk a little bit about this very busy week in security news. Linz, it was kind of seemed like Iran's turn in the hot seat for is in terms of like APT research this week. There were several stories that came out. There was a CISA warning. It seems I don't think this is the case, but I always get we've talked about this offline where sometimes it's North Korea, sometimes it's Russia, sometimes it's Iran, where all the threat intel teams seem to be like, all right, this week we're going after these guys and let's just all
Yeah,
get our research out at the same time.
I know. This is a question I keep meaning to ask, threat intel people that I talk to. Like, is this all related or is this coincidental? Because it's a really weird coincidence, but it always seems to happen like that. And,
Yeah.
we are coming off the news of Iran being at the center of this hack of the Trump presidential campaign like a couple
Mhm.
weeks ago. So I guess, based on what US officials say, anyways, but that seems like pertinent news. And this is kind of coming on the heels of that. So maybe there's some of that context there. But it is funny when you just see like Monday, new research about Iran, Tuesday, Wednesday, advisories, like just one after the other.
I do feel like it's coordinated in some ways, but especially the government stuff, that takes some planning. But I
For
mean, it kind
sure.
of started. I think last week you wrote a story about some recent APT 42 phishing campaigns that were targeting U.S. and Israeli organizations, and then this week there was news about several other Iranian aligned groups. One called, God help me, Pioneer Kitten, that that was released, and CISA released a warning about that, and some other threat intel groups did too. Um,
Mhm.
what was the most interesting bit of news that you saw come out this week around this stuff?
Yeah, I think the CISA, any sort of advisory from the US government is the one that's kind of going to be the most interesting to me, I think. And they basically were talking about this group, Pioneer Kitten, as you said, also known as, I like to say, Unc 757. That's kind of, everyone has their preference, I think. But basically, this advisory was linking it both to ransomware activity and then separately associating their campaigns to uh, things that support the government of Iran, right? So that dual functionality for me, I think, was the most interesting piece of this advisory because we're seeing a lot of these dual functionality types of groups that are across different nation state type activity, right? We see it from North Korea, like in some cases, some other ones where they really support espionage as well as data collection functionalities that are targeting, documents or research that might be of interest to whatever government they might be supporting. And, I think there was one sentence in the US advisory that made me specifically turn my head where they were basically like the group's ransomware activities are likely not sanctioned by the government of Iran as the actors have expressed concern for government monitoring of cryptocurrency movement associated with their malicious activity.
Yeah.
That makes me wonder if there's going to be some sort of blowback against this like dual purpose type of threat group from governments that they are supporting or working with or whatever.
I had
um,
the same thought. Yeah.
yeah.
It That's weird to me because you mentioned the North Korean groups, and they're, I mean, the prime example of government-backed threat actors that do cyber espionage, but also do ransomware. And I think the difference there is that those ransomware activities are still in support of the North Korean government and military.
Yeah.
They use that essentially as a revenue generating activity for their
Mhm.
military operations. From what the FBI and threat intel teams say, we haven't necessarily seen that out of groups from Iran, at least specifically. We've seen some of that in Russia, but not quite as much. But the
Yeah.
Iranian part of it is interesting because you can just sort of picture these guys sitting in a room, they're doing their normal cyber espionage jobs, and they're like, you know what, we're in this organization. It'd be real easy just to deploy some ransomware and maybe make some money for ourselves while we're here. Like, what's
Yeah.
the harm?
That's really where the money is at, right? So
Yeah.
it makes sense from just a human standpoint. But
Honestly,
yeah.
yes. Yeah.
But what was interesting was that, I was digging back into some older stories about Iran and kind of how these threat groups operate. And I think it was last year, Mandiant came out with some research and were talking about how they found a decline in ransomware and wiper attacks that were deployed by threat groups that were linked to Iran's military. So I just
Mm.
thought that was a noteworthy development because maybe there is something that's going in one direction or the other, and who knows what's going on behind it. But that's what researchers have been seeing the past few years.
I always wonder when there's that sort of thing, especially the military stuff, if there's some sort of back channel communications from, say, the U.S. or other Western countries to, even though we don't have diplomatic relations, obviously, with Iran, if you're
Mhm.
like, hey, listen, cut it out. If you don't,
Yeah.
you guys know what'll happen if you don't cut this out. Stop it. Settle down for a little while. Like we don't,
Yeah.
no, nobody needs this. There's enough other crap going on. Cut it out.
Right. That's a good point. Who knows what happens kind of in the background there, but yeah,
Yeah,
who knows?
it's weird. Yeah, so I wonder who's up next in the high chair. If it's we've seen a lot of North Korea. Where there's always research on Russia. It seems like, and
Yeah.
I think I'm guilty of this. You do definitely focus more on the Russian and North Korean groups just because they're so active,
Mhm.
and I think there's maybe more of them just by sheer volume. And I know that a lot of the top end threat intel organizations focus on those two, and as well as China, obviously. Um, but you, Iran seems to be sort of the odd one out sometimes of that big four, but
Mhm.
obviously they're still out there doing their thing.
Yeah, and I think it's worth mentioning there's a lot of kind of headwinds of political stuff that's going on right now with kind of Iran and like, different other countries and in the world. So, obviously that, as I mentioned earlier, kind of the influence campaign aspect of all this
Yeah.
too is top of people's mind. So, but I do think that it's, this is a threat, kind of an area of the threats landscape right now that I think a lot of people have interest in and kind of what they're doing and who they're targeting. And, that was another thing too. And speaking of targeting, is that, when I was looking at the targeting of this group, and then also the Microsoft came out with their new research earlier this week about a backdoor being deployed by Peach Sandstorm. But just like the targeting of both of those organizations, I was like, I think it was everything basically. I mean, I
Yeah.
saw healthcare, I saw education, I saw like higher ed, critical
Government. Yeah.
infrastructure, government. So
Yeah.
they've really got like their fingers in everything. So that's very it's notable for sure.
The overlap that has always sort of been there between cybercrime groups, high end ransomware and cybercrime groups, and government backed actors, especially in Russia, where it's sort of this symbiotic relationship in a lot of ways, it really seems to be rising to the surface a lot more. I think in the last 6 to 8 months or a year or so, especially in non-Russian countries, we've seen it some, as I said, in North Korea as well, but that overlap does seem to be more and more evident.
Yeah, definitely. It's we've seen that time and again for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I don't know why. And maybe they're just sort of getting more brazen, or they're just kind of like, look, there's opportunities here for both of us. Why don't we work together or whatever it is? There's just a lot of it going on.
Yeah, I was talking to Eva Galperin the other day, and we were talking about something else, but she made an interesting point that I think is kind of related to that, which is that there's a limited and finite set of people that are really really skilled at this type of thing, and
Hmm.
and I had imagined that they're going to go kind of where the money is, or where they can get the most support or resources. So
Yes.
I think that's something to kind of keep in mind about when we look at kind of the relations and connections between those areas.
Absolutely, especially in countries where there's not a ton of economic opportunity. And if you have this specialized set of skills, and there are a couple of specific ways you can make money with it, one, work for the government, okay, your salary, your money making is going to be capped, especially in a country like China or Russia. But
Yeah.
in cybercrime, your earnings potential is unlimited. You can, if you work really hard, you can make a lot of money, kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, but that's just the way it works, you know?
It is. You can
Yeah.
become part of Peach Sandstorm or Lemon Sandstorm or
Yeah, yeah.
like groups that sound like beach drinks from, your vacation or whatever.
Who wouldn't want to join Peach Sands, like a group called Peach Sandstorm?
Yeah, if you were gonna,
Sounds
would
cool.
Peach Sandstorm be your first choice? I mean, it's a great name. They sound
Yes.
like they have fun. Or it's like a Mario Kart character.
More than Pioneer Kitten, I think.
Yeah, I don't Pioneer Kitten. No, it doesn't sound like you're gonna live long. It sounds like you're part of like a wagon train and you're probably, you're not gonna make it through Colorado. Yeah.
I know. I
Um,
think your description of Peach Sandstorm as a Mario Kart level is very accurate.
these threat intel teams are having a great time naming these groups. You got to have a little bit of
Yes.
fun, right? Like it's better
Yeah.
than Punk, whatever.
I
Yeah.
know. I know. You're right.
Gotta have a little bit of fun. The other thing that's sort of related that I thought was interesting this week was a report that Google's threat analysis group put out about a couple of instances where they saw zero-day exploits that had been used by commercial surveillance vendors, specifically NSO Group and Intellexa, that were then eventually, several months later, used by APTs, which is
Mhm.
not something that they had ever seen before. And they said specifically in the report that they didn't know how those groups got those specific exploits. And the exploits were identical. It wasn't like, oh, they found the same bug and found a different way to exploit it. No, the exploits were literally the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So it does speak to a little more. I mean, commercial surveillance vendors are a completely different thing than cybercrime groups or state-backed actors.
Mhm.
They're private enterprises. They might have government funding in some cases, but they're private enterprises that sell exploits essentially
Right.
and sell intrusion software. So typically those exploits do not make their way into the hands of other people. Once they're used, they're and identified or discovered by somebody like Citizen Lab or Tag or Microsoft. They're usually dead. Those exploits aren't of any use. So seeing
Yeah.
them repurposed before they had been, discovered and published was really interesting to see. I'm pretty sure the Tag report said they hadn't seen that before. I'm positive I haven't seen that before. At least
Yeah.
publicly acknowledged. Yeah.
Right. It was really interesting. And I think there's a couple different scenarios for how that could have played out. But like one big distinction is that the APT group, APT 29, I think it
Hmm.
they were targeting end day exploits. So it's not like they are like using, these, high value or, they're
Yeah.
not necessarily using 0 days, which is a big distinction. But
Yeah. They're going
um,
after known bugs. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So if it was them, looking at 0 days, which I don't think we would have much, visibility into that at all. But that would be a very different scenario, I think, than this area where they're basically looking at exploiting unpatched or just unpatched instances of vulnerabilities that already, everything was already kind of available there.
Yeah.
But there were a couple different scenarios I think where this could have played out. But the most likely one that because this was what I was talking to Eva about earlier, but she basically was saying that um, they didn't write the exploit until after the flaw had been reported. And therefore didn't even have to go and find it. And they just had to write the exploit for it and were able to exploit unpatched systems. So
Hmm.
that's one possibility, probably the most likely one. But it's also, I think, the bigger thing here is that you're right. This is the first time that that, and at least I agree. I've seen this, and
Yeah.
um, I think also it points to, it kind of made me take a step back and think about the relationship, or like how um, commercial surveillance vendors versus APT groups and government kind of state sponsored groups, kind of their roles, I guess, in the broader threat landscape, and um, how they kind of work in parallel, I guess, because these APT
Yeah.
groups are kind of in support of governments that have a lot of resources, a lot of talent at their disposal, whereas commercial surveillance vendors are more, governments that might not have those resources are going to them. So I think it's just an interesting two different things at play there that, you know, I never really thought about how they work together, or not work together, but like how they their roles are separated. But it's
Yeah.
interesting.
The commercial surveillance market is one of the grossest parts of this entire industry. It's just like there's
Yeah.
nothing good about it. And when you see something like this, my first thought was there's probably two different ways this could have happened. And I mean, there's probably others I haven't thought of, but the simplest and possibly the most practical one is somebody inside the vendor leaked this bug or
Yeah.
sold the exploit to somebody in an APT group to make some money.
Right.
That kind of, it's essentially, espionage. That kind of stuff happens all the time.
Hmm.
Corporate espionage, or possibly a customer of one of these groups or both of these groups did the same thing.
Yeah.
That could have happened
Yeah.
too, because you would assume that some of these people know each other. They're
Hmm.
operating in the same circles. They have some of the same interests. So there's probably money to be made there too.
Right. Yeah. That's it. All goes back to the fact that it's a finite space, and like there's people
Yes.
that talk, and yeah, it's not,
Hmm.
yeah, there's a lot of overlap. So yeah.
Yeah. If you look at some of the reporting that Citizen Lab and other people have done on these organizations, you'll see some of the same people moving from company to company.
Hmm.
They'll, once one of those companies gets exposed, they'll shut down and reform with a different name, and they might have one or two different people, but they'll have a lot of the same people. So it's a
Yeah.
very, incestuous and very small pool of people that are operating in that world. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But a very interesting report. I think a lot of people were kind of like, huh, what does this mean
Yes.
for, the future, regardless of how they acquired the exploit?
Yeah, I texted a few researchers when that came out and said, what are your initial thoughts?" And they're like, "That's weird. Have not
Yeah.
seen that before. And here's a couple ways I can think of that it would happen. Same kind of thing I just described." So,
Yeah.
as Eva told you, the number of people that can write those kind of exploits is
Mhm.
small, and
Yeah.
they know that they can make large amounts of money at it. So, if they can double up on those paychecks in that world, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sure they're going to do it.
Go where the money's at. Yep.
Yeah, they've already crossed a few lines. They're not worried about another
Yeah.
one.
Yeah,
Hopefully.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, great job this week, Linz, as always. And it was a busy one. And now we get a 3-day weekend for Labor Day here in the US. So enjoy,
Yes.
get outside, enjoy the nice weather.
Awesome. Thanks, Dennis.
All right. See ya.